And now, without any ado, I'd like to give an introduction to our speaker. Raymond Blake is a professor of history at the University of Regina, an author and editor of more than 20 books, including Where Once They Stood, Newfoundland's Rocky Road to Confederation, authored with Mel Baker. And he is also, of course, originally from Push Through. He comes tonight back to his home province to give several talks on the theme of Confederation, the first of which is tonight, that titled The People Decided, Newfoundland and Confederation in 1949. And on that note, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Blake.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, for that kind introduction, and Scott, to the wonderful words about this lovely building that we are in. And it's certainly a pleasure to be here tonight. And if you don't have anything to do, or you don't find my capacity to bore too bad, I'm back here again tomorrow evening to talk about Confederation yet again. And I really want to acknowledge the Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society and the Provincial Historic Sites in their efforts to make history meaningful and accessible. And I know to the audience here tonight, you're obviously engaged in that process, but increasingly too many Canadians are not. And so it's great to see you here to celebrate the 75th anniversary of Newfoundland joining Canada. And we should also remember that it's the 160th anniversary of the beginnings of Confederation in 1864 that Newfoundland participated in, but decided it wasn't right for them at the time. We often chuckle over the story that is told frequently in Newfoundland, also told in Ireland and told in Saskatchewan, where I now live, that a tourist in Newfoundland, of course, it's always a mainland tourist who pulls up, asks the gentleman that he sees on the side of the road how to get to a particular destination. You've heard the story. The Newfoundlander looks at her, scratches her head, thinks for a moment, frowns, and says, "Well, sir, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here." That was an insightful answer, because it encompasses a widely recognized truth that where you start makes all the difference in your journey. What I want to do tonight, and I do apologize, I was back in 2019 when this book was published with Dr. Mel Baker. And I talked a little bit about it in different ways, and then of course I was trying to sell books, and tonight I'm not. And I just want to talk a little bit about one aspect of Canadian history. And one of the things that Dr. Baker, who many of you will certainly know, lots been written on Confederation. Often it's been told, we know the story from Canada, we know the story from England, we know the story from St. John's. But we don't often know the story from Outport, Newfoundland. And this book that you see here was published at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, but it's very much a product of Newfoundlanders. Dr. Baker comes from Carolina, and as Rebecca said a moment ago, I proudly tell people I'm from Push Through. We settled to Hermitage, and now live in Regina. And the design of this book, and the cover for this book, and the pages inside were all designed by Duncan Campbell, a young man who grew up in nearby Mount Pearl. So much of what's in this book is written by Newfoundlanders, produced by Newfoundlanders, and hopefully we tell a story that reflects something of the people of Newfoundland. This is an image of the actual ballots that Newfoundlanders received in 1948. And I'm proud to say these are from the South Coast districts of Fortune, Bay, Hermitage, and the district of Burgeo-Lapoil. And when those votes were counted, of course, there were more votes than were used. Those were sent back to St. John's. And I came across those when I was doing work in this very room back in I'm almost sort of don't want to say it, so I'll just whisper it, in 1986. So a long time ago when I was doing my PhD dissertation. And what I really want to talk about this evening is the choice that voters make. The choice that we make when we go to a ballot box. And how do we make these decisions? And quite often, and this is often said about Confederation, that voters made a terrible mistake. 48% of Newfoundlanders voted no to joining Canada. And for a very long time, and even to this very day, people will say, if only those voters were wiser, more informed, smart as me, they would have voted differently. And so the question that Mel Baker and I wanted to address in that book, and I want to talk a little bit about tonight, is, anytime you disagree with the outcome of an election, we sometimes just want to criticize those who voted different than us. Here, I want to show you two slides. One is from 1869, just sort of a little bit of a sort of a promo for tomorrow evening. This is the governor of Newfoundland in 1869. This is a quote in a note that he sent to the British government. And he said, voters in Newfoundland are ignorant, lawless, prejudiced. He used outposts. We changed that to something better, outports. In a primitive state of existence, unfit for educated and intellectual men like him to reason with and tell them about the great things about Confederation. It was a fatal error to submit such an important question to the people. Let's jump ahead to 1948. And I just had three. I could have had many, many more. The Archbishop wrote in the Monitor, and I quote there, I should have put quotation marks at the beginning, and as a teacher I should know they don't just go at the end. But he said it is possible from this result to see that you can bamboozle an uninformed and inexperienced electorate. It is indeed pitiable, he said, that there are still adult people who can be swayed by propagandists. And I underline the words, utter stupidity. A name in St. John's, well known, John G. Higgins of that family, said that people should never have been asked to vote on such an important matter. This is a matter for experts, and he should have added, for people like me. Not the people, 70% of them out there, who lived a different life than he did. And an Outerbridge, the brother of the first lieutenant governor, he blamed the ignorant and avaricious outporters, at least he got outporters right, and not outposters, handing over Newfoundland. And so what we were interested in is trying to understand the viewpoint of the voter. We matter. As a voter, you matter. And I think when we talk about Confederation, we should never forget that the 150,000 people who voted. They voted different ways, but each one of them mattered. And what we try to do is we in this book, Melvin and I, so really were no fools. Many of those people who voted in this election in 1948 were uneducated, that did not have formal education, but they could get in a boat that they built themselves, and with the stars sail to all corners of the earth. Come back home, they could build their own house. They could fix their own engine. They could build their own chimneys. These are not unintelligible people. These are people who could spot a fool from miles away. And what we try to do, and what I want you to think a little bit about, is what is democracy? Democracy, by its very nature, is competitive. We've all participated in the process. And we realize that narratives are constructed, stories are told. We know, of course, sometimes there are mistruths, there's misinformation, there's promises made that we know will not be fulfilled, but narratives are created. And what the 2 or 3 parties want to do, and in 1948 there were really 2, what they wanted to do was try to persuade voters that one option was better than another, that they should take this choice rather than that choice. And whatever choices that are made, people make the choices depending on their worldview, on their fears, on their hopes, on their anxieties, on their faith in the future. We may disagree, but I think to undermine the intelligence of the Newfoundland electorate, who voted 52% to join Canada, is somewhat misguided. And what I want to do in the time that remains is try to show why people in Newfoundland and Labrador made an informed and rational choice in 1948. I have a limited time, and so some of the details I'm going to go through rather quickly, because this history, is known to you already, and I just need to review it very quickly. We know that Newfoundland, like many countries around the world, endured a terrible economic collapse beginning in 1929. And one of the major items that defined that period for Newfoundland was a demonstration on this very building we're in tonight. Surrender of responsible government in 1934, governed by an appointed commission from Great Britain, 3 Newfoundlanders, 3 British, and a governor who was chair. Things changed dramatically in 1939, not because of any great structural changes in the Newfoundland economy, but because of war in 1939. And one of the things that happened in Newfoundland, this is to show you how close this was to here. These are German submarines operators captured off the coast of Newfoundland. But it also the war did a silver lining for Newfoundland. And that was it had a good strategic location. And it brought Americans and British and Canadian soldiers. In 1942, there were nearly 20,000 Newfoundlanders that had forsaken their fishing boats and went to Stephenville, Argentia, Torbay, Gander, Goose Bay for good paying jobs. 20,000 of them just gave up the fishery overnight. And Newfoundland, by the end of the Second World War, had prosperity unlike anything any Newfoundlander had ever seen in their lifetime. $42 million a surplus, even an interest-free loan. Can you imagine? In 1934, they were bankrupt, had to be bailed out by the British. By 12, 13 years later, they were able to loan Britain $13 million, interest-free. So that's the level of prosperity. And it all happened because of the war. I don't think we quite understand how important two individuals were to the process of Confederation. At the very top, a fine-looking gentleman, Clement Attlee, leader of the Labour Party, one of 5 or 6 people that Winston Churchill invited into his war cabinet and made him Dominion Secretary. That meant he was responsible for the dominions, of which Newfoundland, legally, whether it was one or not, it was in the group. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada. Mr. Attlee was responsible. And he was a social democrat. He was a firm believer in the welfare state, which was just coming onto scene in the 1940s. And in 1942, he knew what was going on in Newfoundland, the Commission of Government, and he decided that he would make a visit to Newfoundland. He did come, spent about 8 or 10 days, traveled around, and when he got back to Great Britain, he prepared a memo for the wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. A very astute observer, Mr. Attlee was, and he said, Mr. Churchill, in Newfoundland, from my observation, there's about 200, and due respect to merchants who may be in the room or those in the legal community, he said there's about 200 families in Newfoundland from the legal establishment and the mercantile community, and his exact words were that they absorb an unnecessarily high proportion of the income in the community. That there's a small group, they have all the wealth, and around the island, through Labrador, there's a real disparity. This is a problem. This is something we have to watch going forward. He said that after his visit in 1942 to Mr. Churchill. And it's in the war cabinet documents. You can go and look at them yourself, and they're in the British Archives in Kew Gardens in London. The other person, which was extremely important, is once Mr. Attlee, what a surprise. There's no greater wartime leader than Sir Winston Churchill. An election is had in 1945, and the world is shocked. Winston Churchill loses the election to the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee. And Clement Attlee appoints another social democrat, Lord Addison, Christopher Addison, Viscount Addison, known as Lord Addison. He appoints him as Secretary of State, Mr. Attlee's old job, Dominion Secretary. And those two individuals play a pivotal role, not because they were sort of, orchestrating the outcome, but they believed the political underdogs needed a chance. They believed that working men and women needed their full share of the nation's wealth. They believed that capitalism had created an unfair, unjust, inefficient system. And they talked about the state got to change. And one of the things that those two individuals gave Great Britain is the national NSS, the national health system, the Medicare system that Canada only got, and Newfoundlanders got, in the 1960s. And they were determined, Mr. Attlee said after 1942 to Mr. Churchill again, it is extremely important that Newfoundland win the peace. That once we're over this war, something got to be better in Newfoundland. And they were very much involved in the class struggle. And Mr. Attlee remained Prime Minister until 1951, and Mr. Churchill made a comeback and eventually sort of died in office. One of the things that was pivotal in the Newfoundland journey was Mr. Attlee and Lord Addison decided that when this national convention, which was their idea, and the idea of many people, even many in Newfoundland were wanting this, it had surrendered responsible government in 1934. It was a war for peace and democracy and freedoms around the world, so democracy had to be restored. And Mr. Prime Minister Attlee, when he announced in 1945 that there would be a national convention meeting in this building, 45 representatives would be chosen throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. And Mr. Attlee decided, he was thinking about those 200 families he had identified just a few years earlier. He said, the people around the island of Newfoundland must have a say in their future. And he imposed a residency requirement. You had to live and reside in the district of, there were 28, 29 districts, 45 people, but some were two member constituencies. And Mr. Attlee said, you got to reside in those places that you stand for election for 2 years. And my brother and I are writing a book about our mother in Pushchu. And for the first time, she would vote for the first time in that election because women couldn't vote until 1925. In Newfoundland, then they had to be 25. Men could be 21 and vote. I'm not quite sure if we can see the inequality in that. But in the district of Fortune Hermitage, John Spencer, a teacher from Pass Island, just across the bay, if you know Hermitage Bay from Pushchu. And it would have been one of the few times, and I would venture to say, the first time that a local candidate with roots in the community represented the people from that part of the coast. Thomas Bennett was their representative in 1869, the brother of Charles Bennett, the great anti-Confederate. People like Frederick Carter, another one, represented that area. But for the first time, one of their own would be sent to this building in St. John's to speak on their behalf. Remarkable change. One of the things that Spencer and Smallwood and people like Ashburn from Twillingate, Lester Bury from Labrador, people like Bill Keel from the West Coast, they came to St. John's, and their notion was this state, whatever form it takes, after this convention is over and democracy is restored, whatever form it takes, it got to have at the center of its attention the well-being of the men and women and children across this great country. And they came talking about what we call social citizenship. For a very long time, citizenship was defined in, could you vote? And I know some great work being done by Heidi and Rebecca and others here on women getting the right to vote. That's political citizenship. But coming out of the Second World War, people are saying, never again will we return to the times of the Great Depression. In the Newfoundland, it was the dirty 30s. And I remember my mother talking about, I'm not eating brown bread. You know, she remembered the brown bread that they had to buy. And brown sugar. There would be a different world. And I put up here, these are posters from Australia, the Labour Party in Australia, thinking about housing. Here's a picture from the UK. This is a picture from Canada, building a new social order, family allowances, veterans benefits, ending isolation through roads, electricity. And the people who came were thinking about the state as to provide for our well-being. That's a monumental switch. And here they are. I think I had those two in. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Here we are. And so in the National Convention, this very building that we're standing in, when you talk about Confederation, you know, a lot of people talk about Joey Smallwood. And of course, Smallwood was an important figure, but so were many others. And many of them were some that I've already mentioned. And people like Spencer from the South Coast, like Lester Berry from Labrador, they talked about how coming out of this National Convention, it had to be an activist government. It had to be a government that cared for the people, provided a variety of services. It was important to maintain political stability, to build sustainable and vibrant communities. They weren't that in the Great Depression. It was awful. It was horrible. Everywhere in Canada, Newfoundland included. And those ideas that were being talked about, family allowances, veterans benefits, electricity, you know, running water, things which people didn't have. And Newfoundlanders were listening to those things. And how did they hear? Well, several ways. One, as I said earlier, you know, 15,000 people leaving the coast, coming to those bases and having to deal with the Americans, Coca-Cola, and running water, electricity, movies, a different way of life than they have been accustomed. They went back to their communities and said, kerosene lamps, slop pails, no running water, no health care. And so those people working on the bases really changed the minds. We also had large numbers of Newfoundlanders going to Canada and the United States and seeing a different world. People writing letters back, Art Scammell, for example, writing back and telling, I'm sure they exaggerated as we always do, right? You know, you go to the mainland, you get a job as you know, assistant superintendent in the supermarket, and that's a big job when you write back to folks in Newfoundland. Or it's true too in Saskatchewan, I should say, when you write back to the folks in Saskatchewan, you got a new job in Calgary. It's always the land of milk and honey. But these things mattered. It's a part of the narrative. But of course, the narrative gets to people because the National Convention and the Commission of Government decided that these things would be broadcast. So every day that it was in session, it was taped. And in the evening was broadcast. And the Evening Telegram, for example, said thousands of people are listening every night. And not only were they talking about baseball scores, but they were talking about what they heard on the radio last night. They were talking about the visions that were being presented by Bill Keel. They were talking about debates about what sort of state do we want when it's over. And of course, the Newfoundland Rangers. We all know them. I think there's a plaque nearby here, the Newfoundland Rangers. And the Newfoundland Rangers were reporting to headquarters in St. John's that nothing's exciting to people like listening to those national debates. And of course, we probably all know someone who sits down and watches CNN to see what's happening to Trump. Well, Newfoundlanders were listening to that political debate. And one of the important speeches of Mr. Smallwood on the 28th of October, 1946, most Newfoundlanders know this, he introduced a motion to send a delegation to Canada to talk about union. That's important, but what is probably more important is the words that he said. He said, the history of Newfoundland is a unbroken story of struggle. And he said, we're nothing more than a small municipality. And in quotes, we now know something of the higher standards of well-being of the mainland of North America. We have finally become a people uncomfortable with our low standard of living. We're 50 years behind. People are hearing this. People are hearing this, and they're listening. There's so much to say about the National Convention debates, but I'll make one or 2 points. One of the things that the National Convention did, they created a number of committees, and they went off and studied things as you do. And they came back with those reports. And one of the reports, I think the most, I find fascinating report, fascinating reading, comes from Lister Berry, the United Church minister representing Labrador. He, together with Thomas Ashburn of Twillingate, wrote the Public Health and Welfare Report for the National Convention. It was presented in this building, it was debated in this building, and it was listened to all around the country. And what did they hear? Lister Berry said, the people that I represent don't really care about what constitutional form takes place after we're done here. People expect their governments to provide a better way of life, better social services, and a decent living for their labor. And, there's great comments. One of the best is from Bill Keel, a cooperative worker on the West Coast. And I think if the reports of the National Convention are published, you can listen to a lot of them now on radio through the digital archives at Memorial University. And you can hear him saying, this convention, and you can read it, but I'll read it too. This convention will have to decide if the last forgotten fisherman on the bill of Cape St. George or down on the bill of Cape Norman in the north would have a certain minimum standard consistent with what we consider human dignity. And what those people listening, like the people in the South Coast, along the West Coast, in Labrador, Northern Peninsula, Bonavista Bay, and they were talking about human dignity that they had not experienced through the Great Depression. You can see very, very clearly the narrative, and they're hearing it through that radio. They're listening every night. They're gathering, hearing the story of the Confederates, of those who wanted responsible government. I won't talk much about it, but I'll just point out, the National Convention sent 2 delegations, one to the United Kingdom, one to Canada. When they went to the United Kingdom, Mr. Bradley was chair of both. And the United Kingdom, just think for a moment, it needed to borrow huge amounts, $50 million from Canada, $13 million from Newfoundland. And they put together a reconstruction plan for $100 million to rehabilitate Newfoundland. And when John Maynard Keynes, who worked in the Treasury, saw the number, he said, God, that must be a mistake. They must mean 10 million, not 100 million. Britain is borrowing money. Britain is broke. So they're told that the Newfoundlanders go to London. There's no money. No money. If you go on your own, you have to survive. But what is also important, and I'll say it here before I forget, is Mr. Addison, Lord Addison, who met frequently with the committee, tried to convince the Newfoundland delegation to be generous to all viewpoints in the National Convention. It said if there's a sizable group, doesn't have to be a majority, and if they opt for various options, give them a chance. Let the people of Newfoundland decide, and not the 45 of you in the convention. So he was sort of telling them, and Britain made no bones about it. Since 1869, Great Britain wanted Newfoundland to be a part of Canada. No secret there. That was wide open. And as Governor Stephen Hill, that I mentioned earlier, he made that very clear in 1869. The point didn't change. The Canadian government wanted Newfoundland to be a part of Canada. In fact, in the British North America Act in 1867, it says very clearly, there's a room for Newfoundland to enter and it'll get a certain number of senators and seats in the House of Commons. That was known, no secret. Mackenzie King had said, even before the National Convention was appointed, if Newfoundlanders want to come, we'll welcome them with open arms. And they sent a delegation, the National Convention did, to Ottawa. And they came back after some time with a package for union. Two groups. The convention, as you know, recommends that responsible government be put on the referendum, commission of government, and it votes against confederation. The commission, the British government had said, you are to recommend to us. And they took the recommendation and said, thank you very much, National Convention, but we're adding confederation as well. So Britain set the rules, but as in a basketball game or a hockey game, to set the rules is not to determine the outcome. Two groups emerged. You know them well. I just want to make a couple of points. The Responsible Government League promoted patriotism. Our country, it's ours. We're not going to give it away. The middle point there, don't sell your soul to feed your body. And they would, people like Peter Cashin and others throughout the committees with Responsible Government League, they were very, very clear that it was a conservative agenda they were promoting. No new taxes. People should accept the responsibilities of self-government with the restraint that is imposed on individuals. Be happy with your lot in life. And they said this idea of materialism, awful. Don't fall for it. And comments like, are we going to admit to the world that we can't govern ourselves? All about patriotism and nationalism. Oh, I should say as well, Peter Cashin said the most immoral, corrupt enactment ever passed in the Canadian Parliament, family allowances, that gave to mothers $8 every month till the child reached 16. Immoral, he called it. The Confederate campaign, a couple of posters here. Smallwood and his group did try to create a class division. Blame the Water Street merchants. Blame the business class. And the outports had never gotten their due share. And their image that they presented to Newfoundlanders was those who want responsible government have never been interested in workers, never interested in families, never interested in the well-being of the people who fish and log and do all other sorts of things. They had to make a choice. The narratives have been created. The competing visions have been presented. And voters have to decide what's in their interests. I wish we knew more about women. And I know people, I'm pointing to Heidi in the background and Rebecca and others, some young, bright historians are really turning to this, and we really need to know more. And we make the case in the book, although I will admit, our evidence is flimsy. But we think the big difference in Confederation was women. And probably some of you here can remember the church meeting. I'm making this up, but just imagine it for a moment. The church meeting. Mom and Dad are sitting around the table. And there's a church meeting coming up. You probably remember, I do. Sitting in a house. And they're talking about whatever, the new pews for the church or whatever. And the mom is saying, what she really thinks, and she's right. But when they get to the meeting, it's Dad who stands up and says what Mom told him to say. And Newfoundland women, in family after family after family, a man was away in the lumber woods fishing. Who ran the household? It was women. Strong, powerful, influential women. And we make the case that they were decisive. Now, I wish we had more evidence. Now, I have one little image, I'm just one or two more, and I'll stop. And I have something from one woman in particular. But one of the things that Smallwood would do, and others, as they campaigned for Confederation, they would bring, and I have it down there, bring little Peter up to the stage. Say, Peter, how many children do your parents have? Oh, we have 4, Mr. Smallwood. Well, that's $32 a month your mom will get till you're 16. And you think about it, a place where people never had cash. That's a powerful message. Is it a bribe? Absolutely not. This is happening in New Zealand. This is happening in Argentina. This is happening in Canada. Why shouldn't it happen in Newfoundland? Here, Molly Blake, no relation, in Bird Island. Now, this comes from Alison Fizzard. It's her aunt. Alison Fizzard is a colleague of mine. Her father is Garfield Tizzard, or was Garfield Tizzard, who some of you may know. Her aunts kept a diary in 1948, and probably is too much to read. But what is really, really interesting is on July the 30th, the people in Bird Island got news that Mackenzie King had accepted the results of this narrow election result, 52 to 48. And it was announced over the radio that he's accepted to Confederation. And Molly Blake records in her diary, guns firing tonight. There was a time when you would load up your muzzleloader, when there was a wedding, or the governor was coming, or when something remarkable happening like Confederation, you go out and you fire off your gun. It was a moment of great celebration. That's from a woman, but then if you read down through all of those, everybody excited. And the fishermen, she claimed, stayed home on the 22nd of July because they wanted to make sure that they voted in the referendum. Confederation had its motion. It had its exaggerations. But people were told stories, narratives, as we know happens in an election. And they had to wrestle with them just a little. Because 52% of them said, what we hear, the narrative we've been told, is going to give me a better life, a better province, and I'm voting Confederation because I'm wise. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Blake. That's a wonderful, rich talk and very well researched, and I think ripe for discussion and conversation. And so one of the things we'd like to do now is to sort of turn things back over to you, to the audience, those both here in person, but also those of you who have joined us online in the Zoom for this evening, and to give you the opportunity, if you'd like to ask Dr. Blake any questions. So one of the things that we're going to go and do is I am going to, because for the folks who have joined us online, for them to be able to hear your questions, you need to be able to speak to the microphone. So I'm going to go around and sort of give that as an opportunity for anyone who'd like to ask a question. And I'm also going to bring a microphone back to my fellow board member, or are you going to come and walk around? Oh, wonderful, sorry, our wonderful tech person for the evening, Nathan, who's just been the reason it's going all so well, is just bringing a microphone. So we're going to do a couple of questions sort of from the audience, and we'll also give an opportunity for Heidi, a fellow board member, will read some of the comments and questions from folks on the Zoom so that Dr. Blake can also respond. So while she's looking through that, I'd like to turn it over to anyone in the audience, and you just put your hand up and I'll come over with the microphone. Oh, wonderful. Former president of the Historical Society, John Joy.
When I was growing up, when they were talking about the Confederation referendum, it was always said, oh, it's so slim, it was 51 to 49. And of course, that was not true. It was 52 to 48. And I was wondering whether you and Melvin looked into when referendum were held in other jurisdictions as to the kind of spread there was. And my sense is that this spread of 52-48 is kind of typical when you have a contentious issue. There's very rarely that it would be 70-30 or even 60-40. But I'm just wondering, how did this referendum stack up with other referendum in Canada, in the United States, throughout the Commonwealth, and you know, to give that kind of comparative overview?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Well, first of all, I would say that you know, referendums are very blunt instruments with which to gauge public opinion. But if you look at recent referendums, and I have a number, there's a number that we talk about, but I think I remember two numbers pretty well. One was the Quebec referendum of 1995, and it was 50-point-something to 49-point-something. The British referendum on leaving the EU was 50-point-something to 49. Like, referendums are always close. Now, I'm sure people can point and say, the 1980 referendum in Quebec, you know, was a much larger discrepancy between the yes and the no. But referendums, because it's hard to vote on one particular issue. And people bring in, like on the Charlottetown Accord, for example, was it 53 to 47 or 54 to 46, something like that, which is a larger. So 42 to 58 is a reasonably significant difference. And the Canadian government in 1948 really wondered whether or not this was an overwhelming majority. And then we know in our political system, even when there were two political parties in Canada nationally, it was very, very rare. I think only on like 3 occasions did the governing party actually get 50% of the vote. And as we know from our own time, that Mr. Justin Trudeau is governing with 33% of the national vote. So 52 is about what many of the referendums are, and it's a little better than some, a little worse than others, but they're always close. Thank you.
Wonderful. Hi, do we have any questions on?
How do I turn? No, there's no questions so far that I can see online. Thank you for a very informative presentation. Oh yes, could you respond to allegations that the outcome was rigged? That is the elephant in the room.
I didn't pick that up.
There was a question online asking Dr. Blake if you could respond to some of the sort of narratives and allegations that the results were rigged, as that's an enduring thing that does come up.
Oh, yeah, I'm surprised anyone asked that question, really. Conspiracies make great entertainment. They make poor history. And there's a wonderful historian in the room tonight who said to me not too long ago, she was, hope you don't mind me saying this, was a real nationalist until she became an historian. And I think that is profound. And I've looked at those documents. And one of the things that are sometimes people sort of talk about conspiracies because there are secret documents. And if you go to look at any of the documents in government archives from the governments, they're marked for your eyes only, secret, top secret, do not share. And you can go and you can see, for example, the speech that Clement Attlee gives in Parliament in December the 10th. I'm not great, I'm an historian, but I'm awful with dates, but I think it's December the 10th, 1945. And if you look at copies of his speech, they're all stamped secret, top secret, even though he was going to give the speech in Parliament the next day. Because any of you work in government, you know that the documents that you have, and you're making a policy decision, whether it's over, student assistance or the new hospital, you don't go to that coffee shop and leave the document sitting on the table. So we've got to be careful about when we see things marked secret. The other thing is, as I said here, the British government set the rules. The Canadian government made no secret. The number of things in that book there that we trace Confederation through from it started in 1776 or something like that with Benjamin Franklin. So we got to bring all those colonies together in British North America and create one great nation. And it goes through to 1949. And so there's no secret Canada wanted Newfoundland a part of Canada. There's no secret Great Britain did. But the idea, and the picture I had there at the beginning of those ballots, we hear stories, ballots were burned. Well, these ballots are in this, well, not anymore. They were in this very building when it was Provincial Archives. And you can go into the rooms and look at those ballots and the returns. So the idea of conspiracy, good entertainment, but I don't think it makes very good history.
Thank you. I think I had, yes.
Am I dreaming, or was there ever a campaign to put joining the U.S. on a ballot, a local campaign to join the U.S. instead of Canada?
One of the images I had there was from Chesley Crosby and his group for Economic Union. It really wasn't a part of the vote. And the British government certainly wasn't going to see Newfoundland a part of their nation or their empire or their Commonwealth becoming part of the United States. And I'm not sure the United States, John Fitzgerald, some of you may know, has written a little bit about this. But the Americans have said, we really didn't want to be a part of this. And of course, the Canadians and the Americans were very close. They cooperated tremendously during the Second World War. And Canada certainly had an interest in Newfoundland right from the 1860s. So it wasn't on the ballot. Should it have been on the ballot? Possibly. But I can't see one part. And of course, there were people in Great Britain, like Winston Churchill, wanting to rebuild the empire. Lord Beaverbrook, Max Aiken from Miramichi in Cape Breton, who became in New Brunswick, who became Lord Beaverbrook. He didn't like Confederation because he saw the empire being rebuilt, and Winston Churchill was like that. So Newfoundland would be a part of the British sphere of influence. Not that he didn't care about the people in Newfoundland, but he was cared tremendously about the British Empire. So I can't see them agreeing to allow a foreign nation to take charge. Probably it should have been put on the ballot. I don't know, and been a part of that narrative, but it's certainly.
There was a lot of trade.
I'm sorry?
There was a lot of trade at the time.
Yes, yes. But one of the things that is often said is the Americans wanted our air bases, and they wanted to travel through our airspace. But the international agreements around aviation that was signed by Canada, I assume, I don't know, Newfoundland probably wouldn't have been a party to it, but certainly by Great Britain, is that you cannot use airspace as a money-making vehicle. So in other words, it's free airspace and you can travel through it, international agreements. So the fact that, because Gander exists, and everybody had to stop in Gander, Newfoundland making barrels and barrels of money by charging people, the international agreements said that couldn't happen. And there's a wonderful book by David McKenzie, who also writes about Newfoundland, who writes about that sort of stuff as well. So, it would have been interesting to see if the Americans, what the result would have been.
Thank you. Great question, and always a topic I also always find myself thinking of. Just one moment, I want to check. Do we have any more online? No? Okay, I've got John and the gentleman in the back.
I just wanted to indulge in a little self-promotion. And that I wrote a play that's called Leviathan Unbound, and it's about the case of Curry versus MacDonald. And this was a little-known legal challenge to the whole Confederation process. It failed, but it was that did result in a hearing in the Supreme Court, and then at the Court of Appeal, and they did get leave to argue the case in the Privy Council, but they eventually gave up on that. But we'll be doing a dramatic reading of that on November 20th at the Hall, and it'll be free. It's 7 o'clock in the evening. I look forward to seeing you there.
And I would encourage everyone to go to the performance in November.
November 20th.
November 20th, yes. Nothing wrong with self-promotion.
Mr. Blake, if you would, why didn't the Brits want it on the ballot, the Americans on the ballot?
I'm sorry?
Why did the Brits not want the Americans on the ballot? Was it possible because they thought that might be the choice?
I won't say I've looked at all the archival record, but it really comes up almost as an aside. And it may be like someone said, and any historian will know, sometimes what's not in the archival record. But there doesn't seem to be any great desire among the Americans to sort of take Newfoundland. And there was no great desire. The Americans wanted Mexico. In the 1870s, they wanted Mexico. They wanted the Philippines. They wanted a number of other things. But they had access to what they wanted in Newfoundland. They had access to the base for 99 years. And so they didn't really need to quarrel with Canada, quarrel with the United States, because they had access.
That doesn't answer the question about why the Brits didn't want it on the
Oh,
ballot.
the Brits, you know, I think, you know, even though I said a moment ago that Churchill and some of these other people were very much imperialists and wanted to rebuild the old British Empire, but people like Attlee and others didn't want to get rid of the empire. That wouldn't happen until the 1960s. And they just wanted to reshape the empire as they did with India, for example, as they did with South Africa and a variety of others. So they would not have been keen, I don't think, of giving up Newfoundland to the British, or to the Americans. I think they still saw, and of course Newfoundland itself was very much a British, they called themselves the oldest British colony. So I don't think Britain wanted to dismember and cast it off to the Americans. It's not much of a discussion that I've seen in the record. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I have not seen much, and it really is not a part of the real discussion that I have seen.
Thank you. I've got another gentleman over here.
Yeah, just further to the discussion that just ended. I'd suggest to you that alternate history is even more fun than conspiracy theories. But even though with the luxury of hindsight, it'd be considered fairly silly, could there have been a pragmatic view that inclusion of some form of confederation with the states, whether they wanted us or not, could there have been a fear in some quarters that that would have split the Confederate vote in the original?
Possibly.
Yeah.
But
whether that would have happened or not is quite another matter, of course.
Yeah, when you say are you asking who would have feared that it would split the Confederate?
I'm not really sure. The Brits, perhaps.
Yeah,
those who would set the referendum machinery.
Yeah, much of the evidence, or the evidence that I've seen with people that I've mentioned, and Mackenzie King and others, like they went, really went sort of very publicly that we don't want to interfere. This is for Newfoundlanders to make the decision. And there's been no evidence that they're here playing sort of one side against the other. Now, having said that, the Smallwood was very keen on financiers and businesses who had operations in Newfoundland to sort of help with the campaign. And so, today we would call that foreign interference because of money. But I don't think there was any orchestrated attempt by, the major political parties and figures in the United Kingdom or in Canada to sort of say, can't put Confederation on because, or economic union of the United States because it split the Confederate. Well, they really tried to sort of stay out. I think they really tried to stay out. And what we also have to remember is the British had a contingency plan if Newfoundland voted for commission of government or independence. And Peter Neary talks in his book, Peter, as you know, passed away earlier this year, but his book is about sort of the British in particular, and he talks at great length. But they had a plan. So whichever way it unfolded, they were prepared.
Thank you so much. Just one moment. We have another question online, and then this gentleman here.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. We have a question. Did the Newfoundland experience in World War I promote the idea of joining Canada?
I'm sorry, I have to...
Did the Newfoundland experience in World War I promote the idea of joining Canada?
I don't know. One of the things that we often talk about is things would have been so much different if Newfoundland had not lost so many soldiers. However, when you look around at other nations around the world, in Canada itself, a population of about 10 million, 66,000 Canadians died. You know, the number in Britain was enormous. You know, the number in Germany was high. Those nations recovered. And we like to say things will have been different. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced because other nations had tremendous loss of life of young men, mostly young men. But what I sometimes wonder, and this happened in Canada, and I've written a little bit about this, is that the people at the beginning of the Second World War got involved, people like John Diefenbaker, people like Lister Pearson, and said, by damn it, once the Second World War ends, it's going to be a different outcome. So, you know, a loss of life, but they wanted to make things better. And I sometimes wonder, you know, whether or not the veterans came back and said, you know, probably we going through the 1930s, how did veterans vote in 1948? I don't know. But I suspect, you know, it's really tangential to say Newfoundland would have had a different course if World War I hadn't happened. I don't know. I just don't know. But I'm not convinced it was the pivotal moment that we sometimes want to think it really was.
Thank you.
But I have no evidence for that.
Thank you, Dr. Blake, for your presentation. As we know, the Confederation campaign was a very divisive issue, and the rhetoric from, in particular, the responsible government advocates was quite, as we saw, appealing to people's emotions in terms of don't sell your country and what have you. And then when Confederation won out, a lot of the houses that lined the park here put up black drapes, you know, sort of signifying that they had lost. You know, a lot of supporters in St. John's were, a lot of voters in St. John supported a return to responsible government. So my question is, it seems like maybe a bit of a puzzle or an interesting point as to why the supporters of a return to responsible government didn't really seem to continue that on in the 1950s, and that everyone seemed to sort of accept it. So I was wondering, why do you think that a lot of the pro-responsible government people sort of said, this is it?
Yeah, you know, that's an excellent question, and I think you sort of, you know, you almost answered it yourself, and that is, if you look at the referendums that's happened, let's say in Quebec, you know, in the referendum of 1995 in Quebec, they haven't forgotten. You know, they're back trying to win again. Look at Brexit. You know, you go to Europe, you go to England, and they'll say, we're still European. And they want a new vote. The referendum, 1948, within a matter of days, people have gone over to the other side. And in fact, a number of people, like W.J. Brown, for example, who became an MP in Diefenbaker's government, said, I wasn't opposed to Confederation. I was just opposed to the process. And if we had put a democratically elected government, and then we would have made the decision. And it is really astounding that there's never been a serious separatist movement in Canada. Serious separatist movement in Newfoundland. People, you know, by 1966, when Smallwood was voting or when they were voting as Premier Smallwood in 1966, like he wins everything but 4 seats. And that's after 20 years. And there's no real opposition. They can't get anyone run for the various leaders of the party with credibility until, you know, Frank Morris comes along in 1972. And so I think people so quickly, Don Jameson, you know, joined the consulting firm to help business in Canada get established in Newfoundland. And he was, you know, the person for economic union, or at least one of them. Yeah, I don't think there was a real, you know, the opposition wasn't sort of deep-filled like it is in Quebec on the issue of separation. And people, and even the Responsible Government League, a number of them went into the Conservative Party of Canada and took on the mantle of Canadians. Even though it's interesting, there's an article in the Beaver, I don't know if any of you read the Beaver, called Canada History. And, and Mary Walsh has a piece in there about Confederation, and she said she never met a Canadian until she went to Toronto in 1970. And I read it and I said, Jesus. Oh, I said, in your classroom, where I can't remember the school she was in, they were all Canadian. All the people who were there in 1970 have been born after 1949, they were all Canadian. So you didn't have to go to Toronto to meet a Canadian. They were here. But anyhow, that's just an aside.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. It's what I always think about too, especially growing up in the 90s in Newfoundland and all the talk about moratorium there, that's a theme. Quebec had a huge separatist movement, as we of course know, with the referendums, but nothing materialized in the same way, though, of course, an important cultural conversation. So we're kind of getting to the point in the evening where we have our lovely musicians and we have snacks. We have time for a couple more questions, but then, our speaker will still be available in time to chat, and there will be lovely music from those young city girls, sort of their very, soft music, but we got a couple more. So I believe, lady.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering why Canada was interested, right from 1867, to have Newfoundland part of Canada. Was it an idealism around from sea to shining sea? Was it strategic in a military way? Because there wasn't much more, at least on the surface, at the time. Why were they interested?
Yeah, the strategic position of Canada, of Newfoundland, was undoubted. Like, everybody understood that. And again, someone said to me the other day, when they went to study in Ontario, and someone said, well, why would we want you? Why would we want Newfoundland? And there were strategic interests, obviously. But I think also it was the vision. It was the vision that was laid out by John A. Macdonald, by Frederick Carter, by Ambrose Shea from Newfoundland, this nation that was, extending from sea to sea. And that became sort of a mental image in people's minds. And I don't think Mackenzie King, he said in his diary, for example, he would say publicly, oh yeah, this is 1943, Mr. Noseworthy, who's an NDP member in Toronto, York South in Toronto, asked him in Parliament, what's your stand on Canada, on joining Canada and Newfoundland coming together, Mr. King? And he says, oh yeah, we welcome this, with open arms, once the Newfoundlanders decide they want to come. He goes home and he writes in his diary over the next number of years and said, what in the hell am I doing? This is going to cost us a fortune. It's going to cost divisions in Nova Scotia, because if we do anything for Newfoundland, Nova Scotian fishermen are going to get out and so on. So Mackenzie King publicly is worried that this is, but I think that vision, and he used to say, well, what great it would be if we could only round out Canada under my term. I'd be a living father of Confederation, just like John A. Macdonald. And so I think that vision is driving those people for a very, very long time.
Do you think that religion played any role in the outcome of the vote?
I'm sorry,
Religion. Did you think that religion
Oh.
played any role in the outcome of the vote?
If you look at the votes, and I know I've kept you way, way too long, but if you look at, here's the blue is who voted for Confederation. And some of these areas are very Catholic, very Irish Catholic. We know what the bishop said at the outset. Did he impact the outcome? However, the Catholic bishop on the south or on the west coast is very supportive of Confederation. So what role religion plays? it's a factor. We see, don't really want to talk about Mr. Trump, but you see religion is still a factor in 2024. If it wasn't a factor in 1948, I'd be surprised. And the Orange Order is involved. Mr. Bradley, the Grand Master of the Orange Lodge, the letters that are going around. I didn't talk about it today purposely. I didn't talk about Joe Smallwood a lot because I think people were listening to other things. And for sure, people listen to their priests. People listen to the merchants, but they listen to the wise fishing captain as well. And they listen to the strong woman who lived next door. So I think all of these things matter. But ranking them, where I would put religion, I wouldn't put it near the top. But religion matters.
Well, I just want to say that has been a rich Q&A session, and so glad to see all of you come out this evening and to taking the time to engage with us in the first of our, we've got another night of another address, of course, by Ray. Tomorrow evening, we're so excited as the Historical Society to be putting up a number of events. We've also, of course, got an event out in Bonavista Vista on Saturday, which will also be, of course, available online. If you're willing to make the trip, we'd love to have you, but we're also going to be online in case that's a bit easier to join us that way.